We have Sarah Luchman. Do you want to just raise your hand, Sarah? Sarah is a cancer survivor, a clinical trial participant, and an experienced health consumer advocate and representative. She's co-deputy chair of Cancer Voices New South Wales and has been on their executive committee since 2017 and was elected to the Cancer Council New South Wales board in December 2023. Sarah has been a team member of the CTIQ Informed project since 2020 and the Beyond the Form project since its inception in 2022. Sarah lives in regional New South Wales and advocates for equitable access to healthcare and a just transition for mining communities. Next we have Anne Single. Do you want to put your hands up, Anne? Anne is a Patient Voice Initiative Coordinator, Health Technology Assessment International Vice President, Health Technology Assessment International Patient and Citizen Involvement Interest Group Outgoing Chair. Anne is going to bring to the panel her expertise in patient public involvement and broad experience working in the healthcare and research sector. Gillian, who I dismissed from the panel of experts, but actually is one of our panel. Sorry, Jill. Is the head of public participation for Hunter Medical Research Institute, as well as the non-executive director of the Australasian Institute of Digital Health and Health Consumers New South Wales. Gillian poses the triple threat of being a consumer rep, a clinician and a research active physiotherapist. She is the manager of the Hunter Stroke Research Register and is really here to represent the researcher voice. Finally, we have Carrie Bloomfield. I think Carrie, many of you know, but you can pop her hand up. Carrie is the Director of Clinical Research for Australia New Zealand at GSK. She's an experienced senior leader and business operations manager within the biopharmaceutical clinical research sector. And obviously Carrie is here to provide a sponsor voice in our responses from the case studies. So I will perhaps start at Sarah.
We've got Trina as well.
Oh, and Trina. Sorry, Trina.
I want to swap you.
I forgot to write Trina's introduction down, but I know Trina well enough that I can hopefully do it off the fly. Sorry, Trina, I'm doing a terrible job here. Trina is the Director for Strategic Operations for Bellbury Limited. Many of you will know her from her Director of Operations role at Bellbury for at least a decade now. She's an integral part of Bellbury Limited, the leadership team, and is here to provide a reviewer perspective. In particular, what might an HREC be thinking about and trying to process in responding to flexible models of trial delivery. So sorry about that, Trina. Okay, so we'll start at Sarah, move to Anne, Trina, Carrie, and finally Jill.
Okay. Well, thank you for asking me to join the panel. So I was on a very long clinical trial. I had leukemia, and the trial itself went for about 2.5 years, and then an extra year of monitoring for 4 extra bone marrow biopsies beyond that. So all of my interaction with the trial was just through my haematologist. It was, although I have no idea of the terminology, a decentralised clinical trial. It was through the Australasian Lymphoblastic and Leukemia Group, ALLG. And I personally had 0 interaction with the clinical trial team. I'm assuming that my haematologist had a lot. There was a clinical trial coordinator or nurse at the Royal Perth Hospital where I had my treatment, but I didn't even really have much to do with her either. This whole Beyond the Form project almost sort of was part of the crystallisation of that project, just from a conversation about how isolated I felt during my trial. I was neutropenic, a lot of it, so wasn't able to go out and do normal stuff. And then for the 2 years when I wasn't neutropenic, I was fatigued and nauseous. And I had 2 young children, and I was trying to make things as normal as possible for them. I'd actually relocated to Perth from 900 kilometres away, so that I was near treatment. So I didn't have any support network really around me, no family. I had some friends, but it was a really isolating time. I had a fantastic haematologist, really great support from my haematologist. But I was the only person from Royal Perth Hospital who was ever recruited to the trial. It's a very rare condition, so there were about 20 a year across Australia and New Zealand who were recruited to the trial. I started the trial in 2006, so finished about 2008. In about 2014, I had moved to New South Wales and was seeing a different haematologist, and they mentioned that my trial had been published. I was like, oh, that's exciting. She said, oh, would you like a copy of the paper? I said, I'd love a copy of the paper. So she printed it out for me, and of course I couldn't understand a lot of it, but I knew that I was a dot on the graph. And it was really exciting. And for those who do know, it's quite a well-known trial because it went from a very low survival rate to pretty much 85-90% survival. So really a cure effectively. And I am in complete molecular remission. So it was that isolation, that lack of contact with people, the fact that I was so fatigued and nauseous. There was a number of phases of the trial, and when I consented to the trial at the very beginning, what was going to happen in a year or two was irrelevant really. I was going to die, and this gave me a chance of not dying, so I was never going to say no to it. But I still didn't really know what to say. But it would have been really nice when all the IV drugs had finished after the first 3 phases to have gotten a bit more information about the tablets that I was then starting to take and the side effects of that and how I might be able to manage that. And whilst my haematologist did assist me, there wasn't anything from the trial. And it would have been really nice to have shared how I was finding it as a patient, but there was no patient-reported measures. I wasn't asked by the trial team about the fatigue and nausea, for example, and a simple thing about changing whether I took the tablets in the morning or in the evening actually made a big difference to me actually living properly. So there's, and I actually got onto another trial for exercise for cancer patients and was able to rebuild my muscle mass because I had been in hospital and had gone through a very bad phase and had been bedridden for some weeks. So I was able to rebuild my muscle mass and really got better, but that was separate to my actual medication trial for the leukemia, so they wouldn't have known anything about that. And I just wonder how things could have been different if I had assisted with that. So I was sharing those thoughts with Lisa, sort of started talking about, patients actually do want to hear the results. I had lived that trial for 3.5 years. Not only me, the whole family had lived that trial for 3.5 years. And I was really invested in it. I really wanted to know what happened with my information. And it was only by chance that I got the results. And that just seemed really sad to me. So that's something that I encourage everybody to think about, sharing the results. Not everybody can read a clinical paper. Not everybody's going to want the results, of course, but it's really nice if you can provide just a lay summary, or even just letting people know, hey, actually we're publishing your results and it's been really good and it's led to this and led to that. And I was also very upset to hear a couple of years later that despite the amazing results and the fact that it had all been published, the federal government was still not funding the treatment that I had for people because the health and economics was never going to work with only 20 people a year. getting my type of cancer. But it does occur for people in the prime of their life, when they're in the middle of their careers, with young children, young families. So it has a huge impact on the whole family, not just the patient. So, and I do wonder if there'd been some connection from the trial team with participants on the trial, but when it came to actually trying to get the government to do the funding, I would have loved to have spoken to the government for the health technology assessment, which I've got to admit, it's a term I had never heard until I sat in an arts conference in 2020. And everybody was talking about HTA, and I had to Google what it was. It's not a normal term that most people know. So yeah, I think there's people say, oh, how do we find consumers? Well, if you're involved with clinical trials, there's people who are on those clinical trials. Keep in touch with them, because you never know what else they do, and they may be involved, may be interested in being involved beyond that clinical trial, in other clinical trials related to it, or in your further sort of health technology assessment. So I think there's a lot of benefit to having a relationship with the individual participants beyond just the recruitment and the clinical requirements. So that's me to start.
Yeah, not easy to follow. Sorry. But a lot of what you said, and listening to what we heard this morning, and I apologise, I came in late and missed some of Megan's, and so I really, annoyed with myself about that. So my name's Anne Single, and as was explained, I work in that area around health technology assessment. And if most of you in this room don't know what that is either, that's fine. That's a healthy response to this term. So, you know, health technology assessment is just that process that sits behind, it's a policy research process that sits behind decisions and advice to the government about what to put on Medicare, what to put on the PBS. And it's, you know, it's about clinical and cost effectiveness. And so I sit at that end, and I'm a real dunce when it comes to clinical trials, so forgive me for being a human sponge every time I bump into you on this. But one of the things from working in that area for a long time is what we've tried to do there for more than 20 years around the world is bring in the patient experience to really understand better when people are making a value assessment about the value of new technologies such as the drug you're on. What does that actually mean beyond the data, beyond the primary measure? What difference does it make to patients' everyday lives, and what difference does it make to their families? And so we do that through participation overwhelmingly, but we also try and encourage evidence building, and some of that can be qualitative evidence as well, and it varies around the world. And one of the things you think about when you're in that space a lot is you think about, wow, it would have been lovely to capture this at trial, and I apologise because I don't have to collect trial data. I don't have to deal with the budget or the logistics of it. But the reason I keep pushing on that is because when I listen to Sarah speak and when other patients share their stories and I'm learning from them, I'm hit by how we ask them to go back to the worst times of their lives sometimes. I'm hit by the grief in those stories and perhaps trauma that's not acknowledged well in our system. And I wonder, can we not do that a bit better? So can we not only capture it, but can we stop putting the burden so much? I think we'll always want to talk to patients, and if we stop doing that, we might be in a lot of trouble. But I think we want to think about how and when, and are we going to have to ask people to tell again and again? Is it going to be like turning up at an emergency and having to do your whole clinical history a couple of times before you get anywhere near a ward? So I wonder about that. And when I think about decentralized trials, Lisa will know I'm hugely excited about this, because when we think about evidence coming through and health technology assessment, trying to decide the value of something, trying to decide it in a comparative way, so wanting to know, well, why would we pay for this when we've got this? What is the difference? we know that even if this data doesn't fit really neatly in the way economic evaluations are done, it can come into where the committees deliberate on the evidence. And Gillian is really well placed to talk about some of that. But you can start to see, ask questions, and particularly if the trials are done in Australia, people can be really interested. So you can think about, well, what would that do for equity? We hear about the burden of treatment from patients all the time. Everyone calls it convenience, but we're talking burden. And if we knew more about that, we could probably make better decisions in our health technology assessment. So I really heard also, sometimes, it's not reasonable to get quality of life data. I understand that, sometimes that's a huge challenge. And I was really impressed to hear some of how hard people are working on that with diaries. I think there is also a carer experience, which we don't document as well, which is very valuable as well to learn from. I wonder whether there's ways we can work together to reduce the burden on patients by working to create ways we could collect this data better, with a view that it might be able to travel through our system all the way to reimbursement and potentially post-market review, and all throughout the life cycle come forward, so that when we're talking to patients as we travel along that life cycle, we're not having to start back again. We're talking about interpreting it within the setting all the time and reducing some of that burden, but also so that it's feeding right back and informing all of us in our practice. So those were my initial thoughts, but I was super excited about what I heard today, really nervous about Chemist Warehouse now. But thanks for that, Tanya.
Thanks, Dr. Trainer.
Hi everyone, great to be here as part of the workshop. So from the ethics committee perspective, I guess the first principle is the participants are always at the core of everything that's going to happen in the research. So when they're looking at applications, ultimately it's about how is it going to impact on the participant that's involved. So they're going to be guided by the principles of the national statement, and the national statement outlines a number of elements. So we're looking at the research objectives, we're looking at recruitment, consent, data, and some principles around dissemination of information, and which Sarah just explained how the value of that is. But I guess for the examples, I'll probably focus on those first four principles. So even though there's differences in these flexibilities of design to what might be termed the traditional clinical trials or the different traditional research, the fundamental principles that the ethics committee is going to be looking at are the same. So when they get an application, what is the study actually about? What the protocol covers, what are the aims and objectives? What is the study going to look at? What's going to happen to the participants? What are they going to be expected to do? So in some of those examples, I guess some of the differences are obviously around who's actually doing some of those activities as well. So, in each of these cases, it's not necessarily the traditional patient going into a research site or a hospital, meeting with the principal investigator, going through that informed consent process. In each of these cases, there's quite, they're great representation of the diversity of where clinical trials are, or any trials are actually heading now. The Chemist Warehouse, there might be questions around, well, actually, the patient or the participant that's potentially involved, their first point of contact is with someone from Chemist Warehouse. What information is the Chemist Warehouse person actually going to be providing? What training are they getting about the trial that's involved? What recruitment material are they getting that's about being involved? The committee needs to understand how that process is happening, what information that person is providing to the potential participant, and then what are the next steps after that. So if there's the person that's through the QR code going through to get more information, again, who is that person as part of the process? and then what happens with the information that they collect, and we'll talk a little bit about the data in the future. But with the other examples as well, it's again what information is being collected and how is that being collected as well. So then and that ties in with the recruitment. So we're looking at, again, how are people being recruited into this process, having a really clear understanding of how that's going to happen, who's actually doing it, and what information is being collected at that point, and what information each of those people at the different step is going to have as well. So this is going to be really important for the committee to understand how that all actually happens. And then to the consent process, and in each of these cases, again, there's going to be significant differences to the norm as far as who is actually providing the consent. Is that happening remotely? So how again is that being recorded that the patient or the participant is actually informed about what is going to happen in the study? How do you confirm that that informed consent process is happening? What records are actually happening at those points to make sure that that person does have the information that they need and have the time to consider whether they want to be involved in that study. But then recognising in the example with the palliative care, it may not necessarily be the patient or that can actually make that consent. So if it's not that process, what's the third party consent process that might need to be considered as well? So all of those options are possibilities, but it's about outlining how that process is going to happen, so that the committee can then make some assessments and make some decisions about whether they consider that to be scientifically and ethically appropriate to happen. And then tied in with the consent process, and this came up in the examples as well, that with, I guess, particularly with remote studies and whether there's an e-consent process that's happening, again, outlining what's the platform that might happen, what's the process, who's actually conducting that consent, what training and experience they have to conduct that process, and making sure that then the discussion is clear for the participant and so that they can make an informed decision. But also recognising that the technology isn't necessarily always the best answer, and coming back to what Belinda was saying around sometimes a paper version is going to need to be the way to go, and so making sure that there are options in different types of consent processes that need to happen as well. And then the data. So, there's such an amazing wealth of data that's collected with the research and how that's collected. And again, the national statement talks about making sure there's a data management plan. How is that data protected? How is how is that confidentiality of the participants maintained, particularly when there's multiple places that data is potentially being stored or collected, and multiple people having access to that data. So how do you manage the level of access for the relevant people as well, and ultimately then making sure that it's protection of the participants, that the appropriate people have access to the relevant level of data, that it's stored securely, and then only available to the relevant people as well. So there's a whole range of, I guess, the normal types of things that the committee would be considering, but probably within these flexible designs, maybe there's a few extra layers that the committee will be considering as well. And all of these things are just part of the committee process, but and that's why I guess as part of the application, it's really making sure that all of that is really clearly outlined in the protocol and in the information sheets for the participants, to make sure that the committee can see how that study is going to be managed, so that they can make that assessment, ask clarification questions where it's needed, be able to work through those cycles of comments and and work through on whether, what's the appropriate way for that study to be conducted. That's probably enough for now.
Thank you, Trina. Carrie, over to you.
Wow, this is such a minefield. I just want to address one thing about delivering clinical trial results to patients. Absolutely, a patient deserves to receive a lay summary of the results, so they can easily understand without having to read a clinical paper what happened in the clinical trial, what the outcomes were. In fact, Lisa and I were talking about this yesterday, and a lay summary is something we always provide to our investigators to pass on to the participants. We do have sometimes an investigator say, don't think the patient needs this. It's not our call, but we've made it available. But the good news is we have it on our GSK Clinical Trials Register, which is a public platform that anyone can see our protocols, our CSRs and our lay summaries. So patients can access that readily. But it's not for us to decide whether a patient should or shouldn't have a lay summary. And I understand it may be a situation where the patient is no longer with us, so the doctor may not want to give that to the family members, who also deserve to see the lay summary because they may have been in the group that didn't do well, or may have been in the group that did do well, but for them it wasn't such a good outcome. So that's the bit about, we need to make a lot more information available to patients. However, as a sponsor and as from an industry perspective, we also try to fine line, from a social licence to operate and the rules and regulations around what we can and can't do in our engagement with patients. So in Australia, looking at the commercial side of the end of the whole game, we can't advertise to patients. We're very careful what we can and say. There are TGA regulations about what we can and can't say about our products in terms of our claims. We certainly can't advertise to patients, and there's a Medicines Australia Code of Conduct we all need to follow, as well as a company code of conduct we have to follow. And it does bring in this really risk-averse, got to do the right thing, cross the T's, dot the I's, don't go near the patient. Don't go near the patient, because that's the safest thing to do, just don't go near the patient. But when it comes to clinical trials, I think we do need to get closer to the patient. When I was a CRA, I remember working on a dialysis study and walking into a dialysis unit, and I was going to do some monitoring on those patients in the tea room. And I remember dialysis patients all know each other, it's like a family. And I walked in, and back when CRAs wore suits and high heels, and thank God they don't do that anymore, the patient said, "Who's that?" And the nurse said, "Oh, that's the such and such drug." They named the colloquial name for the drug at the time. He said, "Oh, I'm on that trial, that's awesome. Thanks very much for the trial." So I was horrified. I said, "Oh, don't come for the patients." The patient wanted to engage with the sponsor company, but we don't. So we need to find ways to get closer to the patient while still maintaining our ethical distance, not being coercive, not doing all the things we shouldn't be doing, and being the big bad pharma doing the wrong thing. Again. But the whole flexible trial design, decentralised clinical trials, Australian teletrials program is all designed around the patient, and we all need to get around that. It does create, like I said before, that minefield of, I feel like we're treading down a path to make sure that the patients are well looked after and their needs are met. We need to also make sure that the sites and the investigators have their needs met, because they may not want to be involved in decentralised. It may not be the easiest model for them. It's just easier to have the patients to come in, right? So we might say the patients need to be the ones to make that decision, and they say to us, well, no, because if we're going to run the trial, it's going to be like this. Okay, so let's find some remote, rural, regional patients and sites that we can engage in via teletrials or whatever it might be. But then we come into logistical issues about cold chain product, how the blood sample's got to get within 30 hours from that patient's home to the nearest hub into Melbourne for the CMI samples. How are we going to do that? We have to convince our global colleagues that it's not going to blow out the costs of the budget. Can't you just get a patient in Melbourne? Well, yeah, we could get more patients in Melbourne, but why can't the patients who live remote and regional also have access to this? And fortunately at GSK, most industry is following this. The FDA is big on diversity and inclusion. For them, that's a big race issue in the US. In Australia, we also held accountable, GSK were now held to account for a clinical trial population is representative of our last census data. So it's 70, I'm going to quote some incorrect numbers here, but just to give you an idea, 70% Caucasian, 18% Asian, and then other. And unfortunately for us, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders fall into the other category. We really want to engage that population appropriately. That's a minefield because we're all too nervous to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. Again, we don't want to be the company that's taking advantage of a population, but we really want them to have access if they want. We're not forcing anybody. So this is where the minefield comes in. But we are taking steps, and I think it's great to have the Australian Teen Trials program there. It's great to have that funding. I know some sponsored companies have already decided to walk down that path. I'm hoping GSK is about to walk down that path too. But I think all this has to be a collaboration between ethics, RGOs, investigators and their teams, sponsors. We all have to hold hands on this to get down that path together, because we're not going to get there if we're all butting heads around the best way. And at the end of the day, we really do need to be talking to the consumers of the clinical trials as well. Chemist Warehouse.
One example. Lots of other ways.
We're always looking at new ways to identify and educate people about the clinical trials, even if the Chemist Warehouse model does nothing else but educates or gives people an idea, oh, clinical trials. I remember through COVID there was something about clinical trials, but it's
Is
a great
anyone
way to
here
educate.
from Trial Screen / Opal before I embarrass myself? Okay, so Trial Screen used to be Opal. Hugo Stevenson bought it out. It's now Trial Screen. They have a fascinating thing that solves everything you guys have mentioned so far called Research Friends. And so it's a social network that they build separate to the trial for the indication in the lead up to opening the studies. And it addresses all of these concerns that have come up about involving patients, having the connections, keeping it separate so that the sponsor's not talking to the patient. Yeah.
So we are working, so GSK is working with, we're working with Opal.
Oh.
We don't have the Research Friends yet, because we have a very small, very niche study that they are trying to help us, but they have engaged with the patient advocacy group. We get nervous engaging with patient advocacy groups. We shouldn't, because that could be a great way to say, we've got a trial, put your trial on your website, and it's like, okay. And then internally, I've got to get that past the medical team, and they get nervous about, okay, so many front page of the newspaper horror stories. But the Research Friends is a great idea, and we've got a study coming, hopefully Australia will be allocated, it's a very competitive space. We'd love to work with Opal on Research Friends, so they could engage that whole community, because it is an indication which is it's an infectious disease, it's a stigma disease, and you've got to find those people, encourage them out, build trust that they're not going to be, that their identities, their privacy is already maintained, in readiness for a potential clinical trial, which may be curative, where they have not had a cure in the past and where it's troublesome. So yes, I think we need to think about all the different ways to engage patients. By point of prescription or point of getting your medicine prescribed where you might be on the comparator product is a great way to tap into patients, particularly in the catchment area around where you may have set the sites up. Or where the decentralised or the satellite sites may be, is a great way to tap into patients. And as I say, it also does then continue to, we all need to be saying to everyone we know, clinical trials. Do you know about clinical trials? Clinical trial, clinical trial, clinical trial. International Clinical Trials Day Monday, did a morning tea at work, and I invited the whole company who came for morning tea, said, go and find yourselves a clinical trial, you and your family, because you all need to experience a clinical trial. It doesn't have to be a drug trial, it can be any kind of trial. So we need to hold hands together, walk down through the minefield and let some things explode, because when things explode, sometimes we learn a lot more than if we'd walked around the mine and not had it blow up in our faces. Sometimes you learn from the mistakes. So, anyway, those are my views.
Amazing. And we'll finish off with Gillian.
Sure. I'm just thinking about so many lessons from mistakes. Being a clinician researcher, I'm involved in health technology assessment. I'm a consumer member of the Medical Services Advisory Committee, and so we'll get on to what I was going to say, but the comments about having data and insights as well as commentaries on patient workflows with different health technologies, that is so valuable by the time things are getting towards funding. If there's not a hugely strong case for cost effectiveness, depending on how it's measured, that extra data to back up claims about improving access is so valuable. And there's different research underway looking at different ways of assessing value as part of the cost effectiveness kind of situation. So it's not going to be okay anymore just to make a statement that this will improve access to people who happen to live in a rural or regional area, but pretty easy to actually capture some of that along the way, I think. And speaking of, if I put a researcher hat on, I'm thinking of a research study that we had ready to go, and we'd established assessors and trained assessors at some sites. It was sponsored by Ramsay Research Foundation, and the protocol's published, so I can talk freely about it. But we had set up a observational study to have a look at how your I'm not coming out with a full sentence here because my brain is spinning with all these different things you brought up, like what's actually interesting. We did a bunch of assessments on people who were about to have a knee replacement, and developed a clinical decision support tool to predict, it's not actually a clinical decision support tool, but a tool to predict whether or not someone should have or would need rehabilitation. So looking at their recovery trajectory to aid in clinical decision making, but the tool wasn't a clinical decision support tool. And we'd set things up to go with assessors at sites to take some physical assessments. So looking at timed up and go tests, so a measure of functional mobility as well as leg strength. So some fairly safe and standard tests, but usually that would be done by a physiotherapist, kind of mostly or only in a clinical trial, as well as a bunch of patient-reported outcome measures. And in the development of that, so I'm a physiotherapist by background, I had been advocating for us having a virtual model and a remote model because the trial ran across a number of different regional sites. So people have their surgeries in one place but might be travelling 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours to get to see the specialist. So I just could predict that people coming back for a 3-month follow-up assessment was going to be really tricky and something that wasn't on their radar, particularly just knowing the population. Is people who have been in pain for a long time, they're expecting that they'll be able to be really mobile, so 3 months after surgery, they're going to be on holidays. And so when COVID happened 2 weeks into recruitment, I was very much not excited, obviously, but was given full endorsement to please just make this trial happen completely remotely so we don't have to see anyone. And we managed to recruit 1,000 and something patients. We weren't actually delayed on our trial timelines, and could develop a model where people could have their physical assessments all by telehealth. It's an older population, and I think what the key was to that success was about making sure that people still felt that they were connecting with people and that it really was not about the technology. So we put a number of different things in place. It needed to rely on way too many different systems that didn't interoperate. So, you know, the Ramsay selected, what's it called, Vision Tree platform, like really useful for some things, but wasn't going to interoperate with other things. So we had to put, like, the key was for the patients wanting to take part was that there was this personal connection to the clinic, like the clinical trials staff. And I'll talk more about that because I think it's interesting. But the key for the staff, the trial staff, was just to make sure that we had time allocated to be connecting with each other and just really being on top of monitoring the workflows. And it was a challenge as a clinician and working with the other couple of research assistants who I'd trained up to keep working with the clinical trials manager, who had very specific needs around monitoring data, the whole data management plan, how things were collected, the timeliness and the format, but just to be on top of realizing that for the research assistant, if you've had to enter the data in this way in these systems, it is a massive cognitive load to even just enter a date in a different way or have the fields not be exactly the same. Things like that would have made it absolutely, without changing those sort of things, it would have made it absolutely impossible, because at the end of 3 or 4 virtual assessment appointments, your brain can just be absolutely exhausted, even though they're really easy things to do. And it wasn't something where you could say, oh, well, the trial staff don't need to drive to work, so it'll take less time. You have to put in, particularly if you've got all these remote staff, have to put in actual time and count it as work, where you get together, connect, troubleshoot, do debriefing on what's, like, all that stuff just can't be taken away, because it's, so, it probably doesn't save huge amounts of time, and I don't think we should be thinking like that, at least not until you've really cemented all the workflows and tested them. But for the patients, so this was like people who needed knee replacements, so mostly older. I'm saying, I think we've got a lot of stereotypes around the fact that older people can't use technology, because these are people who FaceTime their grandkids. It's their children who were more technology resistant than them, like you heard. I think you hurt your neck if I keep saying this. But the telling people, and in all of the language and all the participant-facing information in our communications plans, telling people that they could choose to have a telehealth visit was not a good way to recruit people, but saying this can be done in your home, and we will work it out, we'll work out how, and thinking about the types of technologies that we're using are telephone. We had postal options for the surveys, we had telephone support with online, like completing the patient-reported measures online if people needed it, and making sure that, we just stepped people through. We didn't trick them into going, oh, haha, now there's going to be video call as well. But there's all these different ways you can get involved, and you do not need to know how to use technology. And what we found is that people's neighbours were so happy to bring over an iPad for their 2 or 3 times that we needed to connect with someone. People could and did for their 3-month assessments. I don't know, we probably should publish it actually, how many of the appointments happened at caravan, like next to a caravan, because we worked out a protocol where everything was very replicable. People were sent, regardless of whether they were completely technology savvy, they were sent a sheet of paper, sometimes just by email, but that showed you very practically exactly how you had to set out your environment, so that the environment, you couldn't do it on gravel. Like, all the practical things were made so obvious that by the time the patients were sent a text message reminder beforehand, it was customized to, when we'd done a test call, to, okay, you're going to go and get that chair with the armrests that we practiced it on. It's going to be set up there, tape measures gotten out. Like, people were just given practical information so that when you actually made the call, usually they were set up ready to go, knew exactly how it would work. And they needed to know that they were connecting with a human, that they weren't connecting with the technology. Yeah, and we're so grateful to feel like they were a part of something as well. So we sent out a thank you card just before we wanted them to do the 3-month measures online and things like that, to keep people engaged, but also gave them some understanding of how the trial was going, and so they felt like they were part of something. But there was the thinking really deeply and doing some co-design with people who were going to have knee replacements about practically how would that work. Even though it was kind of stood up within a 2-week period, it was kind of intensely, let's actually design this properly and make sure that the HREC feels really comfortable that frail people with pain are going to be just fine to do their physical leg strength and mobility measures in their own homes without physio nearby.